Good afternoon. My name is Greg Lockwood, and I'm the Stakeholder Coordinator at the BC Centre for Employment Excellence. On behalf of my colleagues at the Centre, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. Before we begin, please take a moment to answer the poll on your screen. If you are participating with a colleague or in a group, please select the most appropriate answer or common answer. We will close the poll in a few minutes or so and let you know the results. For those of you who are not familiar with the Centre, or CFEE, it was created in 2012 with funding from the provincial and federal governments to act as a research and knowledge-sharing organization for BC employment service providers and employers. The Centre's mandate is not only to do innovative research, but also to find ways to share that knowledge and best practices with BC practitioners and employers. We created this webinar series as a way to reach out and connect with practitioners. Through this series, we have been highlighting new research by the Centre, but also tapping into the knowledge and expertise within the employment services community. You are invited to view the video recordings of previous webinars that we have posted on our website. Today's webinar poses the question, is workplace essential skills training worth the investment? In this webinar, David Giarmati and Michael Dowie of the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation, or SRDC, will describe the study, which enrolled over 100 firms and nearly 1,500 workers in the accommodation sector across the country in 8 provinces. As you will hear, the findings indicate that essential skills training led to large positive impacts on workers' skills, job performance, employment, and earnings, and a number of business outcomes of firms. David is a research director with SRDC with nearly 20 years of experience in labor market research and evaluation. This includes 15 years of pioneering work with SRDC in the design, implementation, and evaluation of large-scale experimental demonstration projects. For the past 4 years, David has managed several pan-Canadian demonstration projects measuring the economic and social impacts of skills training and adult learning initiatives. This includes the National Upskill Demonstration Project. In addition to literacy and workforce development, David has authored studies in a wide range of areas, including community development, income supports, and programs that use financial incentives to help disadvantaged Canadians make the transition to work. He completed a Master of Arts in Economics at UBC, specializing in labor economics and applied econometrics. Michael has worked on several large-scale demonstration projects at SRDC. He was a member of the Upskill team since the beginning, which allowed him to be involved in all aspects of the project, including research design, project operations, and impact research. Michael holds a graduate degree in public administration from Carleton University. Before I turn it over to David and Michael, I should note that the presentation will last approximately 45 minutes. In preparing for this webinar, David has stressed that questions from the audience are highly encouraged. There are a couple of points in the webinar where we will pause to answer questions, so please do not hesitate in submitting questions or comments you have for the presenters using the questions feature on your dashboards, which will be compiled by my colleague Sean throughout the presentation. We will also leave time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. We are also recording this webinar, and we will post the video on our website along with a link to the presentation slides, with further opportunities for everyone to continue the conversation with the presenters and other practitioners. And now it is my pleasure to hand the mic and screen over to David.
Hi, everyone. My screen look good?
Yep, looks good, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Thanks to the BC Centre for having us. This is great. We're excited to be here. I'm going to launch right in. We have quite a bit to cover. Bear with us as we go through some of the background material, give you an idea of what we did, and then we're going to get to some exciting stuff. We will answer this question with respect to the returns on essential skills training. So as Greg indicated, Upskill was launched back in 2010. It is a pan-Canadian demonstration project implemented in 8 provinces, all but Quebec and PEI. It is large-scale in nature. We enrolled around 110 firms and about 1,500 workers in frontline positions within the accommodation sector. These were largely hotels, some motels, some resorts, but primarily hotels. We're going to talk a little bit about the profile of the sample in a little bit. But I wanted to start with the background of the study in terms of its objectives, its rationale. The core reason for doing this, our funder really wanted to measure the impacts of LES training in the workplace with the most rigorous methods in an effort to establish this business case for doing this kind of training by explicitly measuring the return on investment. And that motivation stems from a few facts that I'm going to throw out there. I think many of us are well aware of these. You know, the fact that over 40% of workers have literacy skills less than needed for their jobs. Since the last PAC result, that's actually up to 49%. At the same time, 80% of those with low literacy are actually currently working. So that's been underlying a shift in funding towards more workplace training. The workplace is a vital avenue for raising skills. But in spite of a lot of anecdotal evidence, some positive, impressive anecdotal evidence that this training is effective, firm investments in this are pretty low. Some of our studies have shown 1 in 20 firms at best in some industries are making these investments. And the question is why? Why wouldn't firms, if the need is this great, why wouldn't they be investing at higher rates? And it's a complex answer, and it's a complex decision for them to undertake, and it has to do likely with, you know, some of them just don't think it's their responsibility to do this kind of training in the workplace. Some are afraid if they do the training, you know, workers will leave and go elsewhere, the notion of poaching. Others are just uncertain whether it's going to be worth the investment for them. Fundamentally, all of these reasons have to do with that, a lack of evidence of the business case. So that was what the primary interest of the funder in doing this. However, the third point here is that it's not just about this number, and this is where I think for this group and this webinar we're going to focus some of our attention. It's about understanding the conditions in which it makes sense to do this training, because the truth is it doesn't always make sense. There's going to be some context, some firms, some workers that it's going to be more difficult to generate positive returns. And others it will be easier. And what we want to do is understand how those effects of training vary and what practitioners can do to actually maximize the chances of positive returns. Quick plug for our funder, Employment and Social Development Canada, specifically the Office of Literacy and Essential Skills, and our primary partners in this undertaking. We're Douglas College, Skill Plan, and the National Sector Council in this field, Canadian Tourism Human Resource Council. I'm going to say a few things about the research design. I obviously don't have time to go through the full background on it, but I want to highlight 3 particular things about this study that make it very unique. The first feature of this is that it is a randomized control trial, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, and I'm going to do that by contrasting this with the traditional way that evaluation is done, with pre-post evaluation. So with this kind of training, what would normally happen is employers would join a project. You'd conduct some form of needs analysis with them. Employees would join the project, and then some form of skills assessment or performance assessments would be done. They would receive an intervention, and then after the intervention there would be some post-training evaluations. And then the baseline would be compared to these. So you'd really look before and afterwards to see what's happened as a result of training. While that can give you an indication of the effect that training has had, the real problem with that approach is that at the same time that you're doing this training, there's lots of background noise. There's market conditions, there's layoff, other economic factors, and employees' motivations and different employee characteristics are intermixed with this in a way that you can't really decipher what the specific effect of training is. And the best way, there's various ways to do this, but the best way to do it is with randomized controlled trials. So this is similar to how they test drugs in clinical trials. Rather than everyone going through the training, once they have joined the study and they've received their baseline assessments both at the workplace and employee level, they are randomly assigned. So half of the group that volunteers to participate are actually eligible to receive training, and half is not eligible. They continue to be eligible for everything they would have been, it's just they're not eligible for this specific intervention. And in our case, the way this random assignment was done is that those firms that actually entered and had their needs assessments done, those that continued in the study, that chose to continue after they had this assessment done, and the employees volunteered and continued in the study after they had skills assessments, they're randomly assigned at the firm level. So half of our firms receive the training, the other half do not. And the reason this is so powerful is that it effectively controls for all this noise that happens around the edges and the differences that could happen for individuals. These two groups, those who receive the training and those who don't are virtually the same. The only difference between them is the fact that they get training. Now, as a result, when we compare how these two groups do over time, either the change in their performance over time and their skills over time, or we just compare their subsequent outcomes after training between these two groups, those are reliable measures of what the training's effect is specifically, netting out all of this other noise, and that's what makes this so powerful. So as we go through this presentation and you see some of these results, you can have confidence in them that they are caused by literacy and essential skills training in a way that you can't from most other studies that are done. That's the first thing that makes it really a groundbreaking study. One of the second features is the comprehensiveness of the framework that we use to evaluate this. We don't just look at their skills. A lot of studies will look at skills. Some studies will also look at business outcomes, but they don't look at the richness of things that we're looking at. We looked at the process of training at the top. We looked at the individual characteristics of individuals, of learners. We look at various structural factors, including characteristics of firms. We look at a very important set of intermediate variables around skills, around social capital, and around psychological capital, things that are happening within the learner's minds and their attitudes and their confidence. And we combine this with things that are going along in their everyday life as well as their job performance. And this is basically painting channels for further learning and for further opportunities for skill development. And we can see how important these are as well as the starting factors to these eventual outcomes and ultimately to the return on investment. And you'll get a better feel for this as we go through because we're basically going to be showing you these impacts in this framework. One very particular important part of this framework is the performance framework that we refer to it. And this, you will see many of our impacts. We'll go into some detail into some of these specific boxes, but the point I wanted to make now is that some studies look at business outcomes, so you'll see case studies that will look at one or two business areas. You will see other studies that focus on the essential skills on the other hand. But few studies really look systematically at what's between essential skills and business outcomes, and that's the performance gaps and the tasks, the performance areas that each occupation needs to undertake. And the reason looking at all three of these areas is so important is because we're actually doing this through objective measures based on industry certification. So we've worked with the Canadian Tourism Human Resource Council to construct, based on their emerit certifications for these jobs, measures that allow us to make this connection between skills, job performance, and eventual business outcomes and establish this very credible relationship between them. So on top of having this randomized controlled trial, we have a very rich understanding of how foundational skills and how literacy improves job performance and in turn what effect it has on business needs. Just to give you a quick example of the kinds of relationships that there are here, you'll see, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here, sorry. You'll see some effects of oral communication. This has effects on job performance in terms of how they communicate with guests, how professional they are, how they solve problems. This in turn drives service quality measures, guest satisfaction, and how customers respond in terms of their likelihood to return to a hotel, something called promoter scores, how likely they are to recommend the hotel, and ultimately driving revenues. We can track all of these relationships, so we can see the effect on skills, on performance, and then departmental and firm level ratings of this type. And ultimately the reason this is important is because of its relationship to our cost-benefit analysis. This allows us to monetize these things in a very concrete way, like you'll see. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael briefly, who's going to describe the program model and a little bit of a profile of the sample.
Thanks, David. Greg, am I good on the audio here? We'll assume
Sounds
so.
great.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the program model and the recruitment process. So this diagram, I'll break it down, but this is basically the program model. And if you look first at the box on the right that starts with firm engagement, that's basically the box of what each firm went through. They heard about the project, they signed up for the project, they recruited their employees for the project with the help of program staff. They went through a needs analysis. And then if they were in the program group, the curriculum was customized where necessary for their work site, and they received up to 40 hours of training. Now, that's basically what each firm went through, but one of the unique features about this project is what we call sectoral leveraging. And while the first firms were being engaged, there was a team of curriculum designers who were consulting with hotels across provinces and designing a core curriculum that was meant to cover the sector. And then where necessary, that curriculum was customized to individual work sites. And that helped, that sectoral leveraging helped garner efficiency for the project. And one of the challenges in developing an essential skills curriculum, as many of you likely know, is there are different ways to do it. Some believe in more organic, where it's highly technical training, where the essential skills basically comes up naturally. To others who are more advocates for training that's highly focused on essential skills, and the technical part comes afterwards or very separate from. This curriculum was really tried to bridge that divide and come up with a curriculum that bridged technical training and was highly focused to technical aspects of the workplace, but really also had some core essential skills elements and some real ability to practice essential skills. So I could talk further on the design, but I think for best move on to the next slide, which talks about participant recruitment. And as David mentioned, 110 firms joined the study across Canada. A big component in BC with 30%, thanks to Douglas College, who was the delivery partner in BC. 88 firms were randomly assigned. The drop-off, mostly at the organizational needs assessment stage, was largely because it became apparent it wasn't a good time for the hotel. So things like a renovation happened, GM changed, that sort of thing. From those 88 firms, 1,454 workers were enrolled. They were spread across frontline occupations, front desk agents, housekeeping room attendants, which was, as you can see by the percentages, the largest component at 43%, servers, bartenders, and the smallest component, which was kitchen line cooks and kitchen help. Turning now to the next slide, I'll give you a little flavor of who these employees were. 72% female. That was largely a function of the fact that of the high proportion of housekeepers in the project, and the vast majority of housekeepers are female, not exclusively, but largely. Average age of participants was 38 years old. The tenure, generally we found, and this was by design more than by accident, these were the longer tenured component of the hotel workforce that joined the project. We asked that the people who joined would be with the hotel for several months. So the tenure was 5.6 years. The wages were not excessively high. They were a net of about $12. 90% have a permanent job, and 43% never work overtime. That's sort of the intro piece to how we set up the project, and this is probably the first point to Sean. If you have any questions coming in, this would be a good time to ask the first round.
Hi, Michael. We actually don't have any questions that have come in yet, so we're just sending out a reminder to folks. Everyone's welcome to submit their questions, and we'll pass those on to you at the next little pause.
Sounds good. Okay. Without further ado, then we'll launch into the meat of the impact. So the treatment control differences. And the first fundamental question is, does upskill training produce measurable impacts on literacy and essential skills? This is one of the more fundamental research questions. If this didn't happen, the other impacts that follow are more tenuous. So as many of you are aware, that literacy is, or document use and numeracy is rated on a 500-point scale with broken up into 5 levels, and a level is about 50 points, roughly speaking. So participants' literacy scores on standardized tests increased by 11 points immediately after training and up to 18 points, which is about a third of a level 6 months after training. I'll deal with the next bullet more on the next slide, but employees with literacy skills at the required level increased by 22 percentage points. As many are you aware, a level 3 is often seen as the benchmark. And this slide here shows, that's now on the screen, shows the impact of the program on the percentage of participants in each level. So on the vertical axis, it is the impact of the program on the percentage of participants at each level, and on the horizontal axis, it's the number of the horizontal axis just breaks participants into lower level 1, upper level 1, lower level 2, upper level 2, and level 3. And it's the last bar that I'd really like you to focus on. It's the last bar that really is the big jump. You notice the 21.5% change in the composition of the level 3. As a result of the project, the proportion in level 3 is up by 22%. The other interesting component of the essential skills results is that for the average employer, which has about 15 people per hotel, this translates into an additional 3 workers meeting the literacy requirements of their job, in other words, being at level 3 following upskill training. So I'm going to pause there and throw it back to David who talk about the performance impacts.
Thanks, Mike. Audio's good?
Yep.
I'm going to make one other point here. For those of you who are connected with this field, you probably heard this debate that this is kind of like the most basic question: does literacy essential skills training lead to improvements in literacy essential skills? It's kind of like you would assume that it does. However, the debate about this is quite pointed, and over the last few years, there are some that feel you get gains quickly and then they'll peter out, whereas others feel it's really hard to get these kinds of gains and that it takes time through literacy practice. We've in fact shown that both of these are in fact true. You can get literacy gains quite quickly. We've seen 11 points immediately after training, and then they grow over time. So about 6 months later, it's at 18 points. Another really interesting thing, we're not showing a figure here though, is if we separate it out even further into those who received training or received an assessment after 12 months, the change is even greater. It's up to 23 points at that point, which is nearly half of a level. So literacy gains can happen quickly, and they do in fact grow over time through literacy practice, through engagement in further literacy practice, both in the workplace and outside of the workplace. And we'll talk a little bit more about those mechanisms in a bit. The next thing we'll look at, though, is job performance, because literacy is just the beginning of this. There are many other essential skills and many other components of job performance that we looked at. I'm not going to run through all of them. We have a rich set of figures and tables in the full report that you can look at. We basically picked apart this industry certification. It's observational based again. They're looked at before and afterwards in terms of their performance. These are done largely through job shadowing. And when you look at the different components of these assessments, we see very large impacts on a whole range of areas. How they engage with customers improved by over 20 percentage points in terms of participants meeting the industry standards for that task area. Productivity in terms of organization and teamwork up 15 percentage points. Health and safety practice, emergency preparedness, safe handling of chemicals, all up 12 percentage points. And then service quality, these are components of their job, very occupational components of their job, like how they may make a bed, a housekeeping room attendant, or how they clean a bathroom. Meeting very high, this is a very high standard of evidence here that they have to meet all of the items in their service standard we saw impacts on. And related to this, the point that I would also emphasize that Michael made is that this training was in fact foundational skills training. It's essential skills training. It is not technical training. It is foundational skills training that is contextualized within an occupational framework. So it was highly relevant to what the workers were doing, but they weren't being trained in technical tasks. They were being trained in foundational skills. So the fact that you see this breadth of performance improvement is pretty remarkable. And this is one of my favorite figures of the whole study, in fact. This shows you certification rates. This is the participants who are able to perform at certification levels. There's 3 components to certification. There's a knowledge exam, an experience, and then there's a performance component. This is the performance component of certification. If this is the control group over here on the right, the gray bars, about 60% before and afterwards are passing training or for passing certifications. This is basically telling us that 2 in 5, 40% of participants are failing to meet the standards for their job. That's why there are business gaps, there are business needs, because there is poor performance. But now if you look in the program group, the change between baseline and follow-up, the difference between these changes between program and control group is 12 percentage points. So 12 percentage points more are now passing certification compared to where they would have had they not participated in essential skills training, which is a remarkable change given that this is a very modest training intervention. On average, it's about 19 hours of essential skills training, and we're seeing this depth of improvement on overall job performance. The related question to this, though, is what does that mean? Does it actually translate for participants into labor market gains, employment and earnings? And this is probably my second favorite figure. We look at both job retention, unemployment rates, and overall earnings. What this figure is showing us is what each of the groups, participants in the program group and control group, what they're doing. This biggest bar is showing that they're working with the same employer that they started with. 91% of the program group continues to work with that employer up to 12 months later. Look at the control group, though. Only 83% are employed with that same employer. This is a job retention effect of 8.5 percentage points resulting from essential skills training. The other interesting one is this second bar here, which is those who had an unemployment spell in the last year. 8.8% of the control group had an unemployment spell within that 12-month period, compared to only 2.8%. Which is a 6 percentage point reduction in unemployment spells. And this translated into about $1,900 more in earnings for participants as a result of this. This is also a fairly remarkable effect. And a lot of the case studies have emphasized this fact, but the fact that we are showing this through an experimental design is pretty striking result and pretty convincing result. And we'll talk more about the implications of this job retention for businesses in a moment. Turning to financial impacts on businesses, it's one thing to have performance improvement, but does that align with what the business actually wanted? Given that we developed this framework in consultation with businesses and that our model has this customization role, the hope is that it would. And in fact, it does. When we look at it again, I don't have time to go through all of them. The report has very detailed figures and tables in all of these different areas. I'm just going to highlight a few of the really interesting ones. Guest satisfaction, which is a key outcome related to the ability of participants to communicate and respond to concerns that guests have, has improved dramatically. Over 70% of the participating firms had increases in satisfaction compared to only 40% in the program group. Another way to look at this is in terms of the incidence of customer complaints, and this is one of the largest impacts I've actually ever seen in my time doing this. 75% of the participating firms showed reductions compared to only 24% in the control group. And this figure shows that as well as showing the scale of these reductions. So the gray bar are control group firms, the orange bar are the program group, and we see this huge reduction in basically an increase in those firms that are showing reductions in complaints. And these are significant reductions, firms reporting these as very large reductions of 5 or more complaints per week. That's on the revenue side, and what that basically translates into is increased occupancy rates and increased spending of guests when they're there. And this translated into about $2,200 per participants in incremental revenue for program group hotels in that year after training. From a productivity perspective, there was also cost savings, and these arise from the improvements in organization, the improvements in efficiency. This is directly on participants themselves and how they perform their job. It resulted in $1,000 in savings per participant. Another really interesting one, though, was on the indirect effects on supervisors. Supervisors were more confident in the work of staff, which led to reductions in the amount of time they spent monitoring and having to correct their work, and that translated into about $1,200 in savings per participant. On top of that, that retention effect, that 8.5 percentage point retention effect, is basically one foregone hire within that year, which itself is about $4,400 per firm, or about $300 per participant. Now, I know I'm throwing a few different numbers at you. We're going to sum all this up for you in a moment when we turn to the cost-benefit analysis and the return on investment. We basically sum all of these up and we combine it with the cost of the program to boil it down for you to say whether there is actually a return. Before we do that, though, we're going to take a little bit of a segue, because there's really some exciting non-financial impacts of this on participants and firms, and we just wanted to highlight a few of these. We don't want to gloss over them. So I'm going to turn it to Mike, who's going to talk just a little bit about the non-financial impacts.
Thanks, David. So the question here is, does upskill training improve non-financial outcomes such as social capital, health, and well-being? And unfortunately, I just have the time to sort of scratch the surface. Again, we're putting in lots of plugs for our report, but I'll put in yet one more. To if you're interested in this area, there's much more detailed results in the report. So on the next slide, I've got sort of three big outcomes that I'd like to highlight, and then I'll just mention these quickly, and I'll drill down a little bit in the next few slides to illustrate them. Participants experience improvements in their confidence, attitudes towards learning, as well as increased social capital and reduced social isolation. There was a reduction in stress, and there was an increase in what I call continuous learning or engagement in further learning. The impacts on psychosocial outcomes. What we did here is, rather than just look at one outcome in isolation, we summed together a bunch of indicators and looked at how many indicators change. So here is one composite that combined receptivity to continuous learning, motivation and engagement, future orientation, confidence and essential skills, self-efficacy, and trust. And if you look over to the right-hand side on the 3 or more, you notice that the program group was about 15% more likely to have an increase between baseline and follow-up in 3 or more indicators, whereas on the left-hand side, the control group was more likely to be, if you will, stuck at 2 or fewer indicators. Now, turning to the next slide, which is David's pointed out his favorites. This is one of mine. Is a dramatic reduction in stress. So the question was, have you noticed any reduction in the amount of stress you experienced at work? And you notice that the program group is much lower in the not at all, and those numbers, those people have moved into the very little and some. So they've gotten from noticing not at all in a change in stress to very little or some. And the impacts are still fairly large here. The impact in the very little and the some category are in the neighborhood of about 11 percentage points. And highlights engagement in learning. What we did is we asked it 2 ways. In the about 9 months between the baseline and the follow-up survey, we asked, have you taken any training other than upskill since enrollment? And the program group was more likely to say yes than the control group. The other way we asked it is, are you planning on taking, at follow-up we asked, are you planning on taking training over the next 12 months? This was a large impact between the program and the control group, where the program group was more likely to make plans for further education over the next 12 months than the control group. So that's it on the whirlwind tour of the non-financial outcomes. But and this is sort of pause number 2 here. If Sean and Greg, if you want to fire questions away, then this would be a good time.
All right, thanks, Mike. This is Sean here. We've had a few questions come in. One of the first, we've had a number of questions about the nature of the training itself. What was its length, and can you give some examples of what might be included in the training?
Sure. So it wasn't specific in that it wasn't prescriptive in that it was an established set number of hours. It was kind of like a negotiation, how much a combination of how much they needed, but also how much the business was willing to provide. As many of the practitioners likely know, it is tough to do workplace-based training because of the ongoing business dynamics and the business constraints. So the offer was basically between 10 and 40 hours of training. It was a blended model where it could be delivered in group sessions with some one-on-one, pretty flexible. Generally, it was delivered over a 4 to 6 week period, but sometimes it was delivered very quickly over a week. Sometimes it was a little longer, over a 3-month period. On average, the amount of training was just under 20 hours. That's 19 hours of training. In terms of the kind of training that they received, again, it was contextualized within that occupational framework you saw. So it would fall within customer engagement, it would fall within productivity, it would fall within health and safety, but the training itself was foundational in nature. So it would be oral communication in the context of customer engagement. So there would be exercises in how they would articulate themselves in from the range of basic greetings with hotel guests to a little more complex ones involving a degree of problem solving. In terms of the productivity and efficiency, it was highly linked to document use. So in processing reports, the kinds of incident reports that a housekeeper or a front desk agent would have to complete, and that's where reductions in errors and efficiencies were seen. So again, foundational in nature, but occupationally relevant.
And not only that, occupationally specific. There were 4 curriculums designed, and each one for each of the 4 occupational families, and it was pretty rare when occupations were combined. It was housekeepers taking housekeeper training, so it was really targeted at their specific occupation, not general tasks in the hotel.
Okay, thanks, guys. Can you tell us a bit more about the nature of the firms that were recruited for this project, who participated? And then how were their employees selected? Was this a compulsory program, or were they volunteering?
Sure. So we did gloss over that. In some other longer presentations, we do have a firm profile section, and it's all in the report there. But there are largely, as we've said, hotels. There are some resorts and some motels, but for the most part, they are hotels. They are SMEs. Large majority of them are SMEs. Most would fall under 100 employees. A good chunk of them were within 1 to 200, and then a minority were within the 200 to 500 range. In terms of how they were recruited, the initial engagement process was a collaborative exercise with the National Sector Council and their provincial counterparts. And so it was not a random sample, if you will, where we, pulled randomly from a sample of all of the hotels across Canada. It is basically a mix of those that our partners had the best opportunity to actually recruit. But when you look at the profile of hotels and you look and the workers and you look at the mix of ours are pretty similar to the mix that you would have across the country. This was completely voluntary. None of the firms obviously had to participate. The research was voluntary for the individuals, so once the employer signed on and agreed to continue after their own needs assessment, an offer was made through an information session to the workers. So there is a distinction, of course, I don't want to gloss over this, between the research and between the training. And the research was 100% voluntary, and we did informed consent. They knew what they were getting themselves into, and they could opt out of that. The training itself was also meant to be voluntary, but there is this notion, people in the field refer to it as voluntold, where an employer might encourage someone to participate, and that happens to a degree. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit in the next section in terms of the importance of engagement. If someone's being forced to take training, there are other things people are going to be a little less engaged in it. But for the most part, it was a voluntary program, and research was 100% voluntary.
Okay, well, thanks. And then we have a last question about the characteristics of the participants themselves. We've had questions about the extent to which participants required ESL training, and also, did you have a proportion who were temporary foreign workers?
You want to take it, Mike?
Sure. So there was no screen. It was a wide open application process in the sense that it was self-selection. Do you think you could benefit from the program? And there was no screening for, we had originally thought about a language level screening, but it just became logistically a bit of it didn't feel like it was going to work well. So it was wide open, people self-selected. There were pockets where there were high ESL. We worked in Whistler, for example, and a lot of the housekeepers are English as a second language there. So there were pockets across Canada where there was a high ESL population. We did find, though, we debated this a lot in the beginning. And as to whether people with limited English skills could benefit from the project. What we found at the end of the day is that they could, and there were impacts for people who had a level one to begin with. As far as temporary foreign workers, we didn't ask a question. Our suspicion, and we didn't screen out either. It was sort of if you're an employee of the hotel and you're legally entitled to work in Canada, you're legally entitled to be part of the project. We suspect that areas where there are high temporary foreign workers, there were some in the project, but we don't have confirmation of that.
And just in terms of the proportion, we had, I think it was closing in on 40% that were immigrants in the sample. And as Mike suggested, they did indeed do very, very well. The report goes into a full subgroup analysis across 6 or 7 different subgroups, and immigrants performed very well.
Okay, thanks. We'll hold off on our questions until you've finished your presentation.
Okay, sounds good. Drum roll, the big question, return on investment. Did all these wonderful impacts actually justify the cost? Before showing you the table, short answer is yes. Average returns are in the neighborhood of 23%. Firms gained revenue, they gained from cost savings, totaling around $4,600 per participant, which more than offsets the cost of training and incremental earnings, leaving a benefit of about $577 for an average return of 23% return on investment. This chart looks a little more complicated than it is. This just shows participant gains, firm gains, government budget, and then the sum of all three. And the key point to take away, a couple of key points, is that these are incremental effects. So this isn't like a regular costing analysis that you might see. These all arise from the randomized control trial, so they are incremental as a result of this training. The bottom panel shows you the costs of delivery of this program. So basically it costs firms, if they bear the full costs of the training itself, around $2,250 plus another close to $300 in release time for the actual workers. These costs for government budgets, and again in the report it gives you a full breakdown, are primarily for the initial engagement of the sector and the design of the core curriculum. So those we're assuming are going to be borne by governments or some central agency that would support the implementation. What this is basically showing us then is when you incorporate the participant impacts and the firm effects, we can sum and see what happens. So just to walk you through quickly, participants, they get earnings gains obviously as a result of their incremental employment. They pay taxes on that, and they actually have a little foregone EI, so they're receiving EI a little less frequently. And they do give up a little bit in terms of choosing to do this on their own time in terms of training, but as a result, this model is a huge, results in a huge benefit for participants, 3,000% return on investment, because they don't bear a lot of the costs. That's the first lesson from a workplace model. It's a huge plus for participants. But then even for firms, they pay the incremental earnings for participants, most of them, in terms of the firms that are within the study. Some went on to other firms. They get the benefits of sales revenue, the cost savings from terms of productivity and hiring. They pay a little bit increase in corporate taxes, and they cover the program costs. This is still leaving them with $577 for a return of 23%. Governments themselves also have a positive return in terms of taxes that they get, corporate taxes they get, that more than offsets the cost of the program. Now, just one more brief comment before we do move on is, the reaction that I get to this is really interesting in terms of this 23%. Some individuals are saying, oh my God, that's so large, compared to traditional investments that a firm might make. Others are, comparing it to some of the case studies. I've heard 500%, 600% return on investment. That's what you need to keep in mind. This is an average, right? It varies significantly. So you'll have some firms that are getting really large returns and some firms that aren't getting any. And that's what we really want to understand. We want to understand how these returns vary. What is it that we can do that can maximize these returns? And that's what I'm going to move to now. How can practitioners maximize positive effects? Training impacts vary by context and breadth of need. And initial assessments and the customization of training are critical to generating those positive returns. If you take anything away from this session, this is it. Do a very good organizational needs assessment that looks and covers some of the conditions we're going to talk about, and then customize a training solution to meet those needs at both the learner and the workplace level. And I know a lot of practitioners do this, but often they just go through the motions of doing an ONA because it's something they have to do. Sometimes for funding purposes, or sometimes just because they do it and then they customize around the edges. But really, what you're going to learn through a good needs assessment at the organizational level and then through surveys with participants is vital to generating that return and how you generate it. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about in terms of what some of those key characteristics are. And I'm going to show you how different these outcomes can be and being sensitive to them, how you can get that 23% up. Basically, that's an average return, but you can generate these 200–300% return on investments if you're properly assessing and properly aligning training. So in terms of business characteristics that you figure out at the time that they're enrolling, so this is before training has taken place, business needs are vital. You really need to understand what the nature of those business needs are and the breadth of those business needs. And that becomes easier when you prepare, obviously, and you go in with this framework and you really know what the occupations have to do, because you can help an employer by probing on those characteristics. If you have a tool to do the assessment, that's good, but really you need to think about what the workers themselves have to do and then probe with employers and probe with supervisors to really figure out what the nature of those skill gaps and those performance gaps are, so that you can determine how to best target them. Your ability to do that is really, determined in part, not just based on how prepared you are to do it, but in terms of how prepared the employer is to do it. If there is a very clear understanding of how skills link to performance, you're going to have an easier time doing it, and you're going to have an easier time helping the employer create a plan to utilize that training. You have to be thinking about transfer to the workplace, how your training is going to affect work on a day-to-day basis. And again, your ability to do that is predicated by the learning culture of the organization. Have they done this before? And even if they haven't, are they aware of their commitment to training? Will they work with you to help supervisors utilize that training? And here's some concrete examples. I'm going to come back to a few of these other ones of how this manifests itself in our results, just to show you how important need is. So we asked employers a simple question as part of the organizational needs analysis. What is the degree of need for training, or phrased another way, how are you performing in each of about a dozen, I think it was 15 areas we asked them, along the lines of that framework that you saw at the beginning in terms of how they're engaging with guests, productivity, health and safety, and so forth. And when employers are able to articulate needs, things are different. So look at this chart. It breaks it down by having very few needs versus having large needs. And what this is showing us is the point gain on skills, short-term skills gain. So this is the TAU's estimate immediately after training, broken down by the responses of employers. And what this is showing us is that in the short term, firms with low levels of skills or low levels of need and firms with high levels of need, you can get skill gains for them. And that's often superficially how a lot of impacts and effects of training are looked at. They only look at skills right after the training. And this kind of suggests that, oh yeah, this is great. You can get skill gains for both groups. Notice what's happening here. You get, even in the control group without training, for those who have few needs, you're getting some improvement naturally. But watch what happens when you look at the second follow-up assessment. This is longer-term assessment. Those with very few needs are both improving. Without training is the gray bar. With training is the bar. There's no impact for those firms that have few needs going in. But look at the difference for those who have 6 or more core needs. The control group is getting much, much worse. That's what's underlying these needs that the employers are suggesting. You're seeing a deterioration for those that don't get training in the skills. But look what happens for those who actually receive training. This is the difference between the two. That's like 27 points, which is remarkable. But even more striking is the effect on job performance. Look at those that have no or fewer needs. There's no effect on job performance, at least with respect to certification rates versus control and program group. But those who have more needs, massive impacts on job performance. This is what is driving ROI. You need to understand the framework of need, and you need to speak about it with the employer going in, and you need to help them figure out what those needs are in detail. And if they really don't have need, that's one of the biggest constraints on ROI, is doing training when they don't need it. If you're training people who don't need it, you're wasting your money. Aligning with need is the best way to hit returns. Another one that I want to highlight for you, this chart looks more overwhelming than it is. I'll walk you through it. It's really easy. It's learning culture. And one simple indicator of the extent of learning culture is how much training individuals and employers are reporting that they spend. I'm going to draw your attention to this bottom panel. These are document use scores, and it's this figure I want you to focus on. This is the point gains, and it breaks it down into the short-term gains and the longer-term gains by how much training prior to this upskill intervention they have been delivering. Impacts are less when you have had less training in the past. Those who have experience doing this kind of thing are going to generate returns. But nonetheless, you can still get some impacts when you actually have lower amounts of training. So it's not that you can't make a difference, but I draw your attention to performance. This is what is remarkable to me. I mean, you can get performance gains when you have little experience with essential skills training or any training. You get bigger ones when you have more experience, but look at this bottom row. This is a question, how much have you spent on training in the last 6 months? This is an indicator of an employer not having a significant culture. If they cannot tell you how much they've spent on training, and there were categories where they could give us estimates. They didn't have to give us an exact dollar figure. These firms are not able to tell us anything about their training, which is a proxy for having less learning culture. They don't generate any performance gains. So this is one possible indicator that you would want to look at too. What experience do they have with it as a gauge for how receptive and how helpful they're going to be and how able they're going to be moving forward to support the use of that in the workplace to have this performance impact. Running low on time, I'll just take a couple of more minutes, Greg. In terms of participant characteristics, these are vital too. Again, look at the report. There's a lot of really interesting stuff here that I don't have complete time to go through, but I'll highlight two really interesting ones. In terms of starting skills, if you've been in this field for some time, you may know that it's often referred to that, the biggest bang for the buck can come from those who are upper level 2, who are close and only need a little bit of training. Our results seem to suggest otherwise, that it is, while you can get improvement for that group, they actually improve without training in terms of their effects on job performance through whatever other means the firm may have, mentorship or feedback with the supervisor. The ones who drive ROI, the ones who get performance improvement, are actually the ones who are lower, ones who are at upper level 1 or lower level 2. So seeing the mix of need at the individual level in addition to what employers are saying is pretty important. And don't discount, need that is greater than what you may have in the past. If it's someone's at upper level 2 and you have a strong mix of others that have upper level 1, you can generate significant returns with that kind of a mix. Another interesting one that you need to be aware of is with respect to trust. And I won't get into the specifics of the actual measures, but any indications that you have that there is a dynamic in the workplace that is problematic, either union management issues, or anything that could compromise the collaboration between management, supervisors, and workers to support the transfer of that learning into the workplace, you should be cautious. And to show you an example of how this manifests itself, similar chart for skills and the impacts on performance broken down into low and high trust environments. Skill gains, you can get them in both low and high environments. You get them larger when they're in high trust environments, but they're still there in low trust environments. But look at performance. Performance improvement is only observed in those hotels. This is the percentage that are passing certification in the program versus control group. You see it in high trust properties. In low trust properties, there is no difference. They're getting skill gains, but they're not transferring it to the workplace. So you need to be aware of the extent to which there are trust-related concerns, mass layoffs that just happened, or any union strife that may be happening, or between departments that could compromise transfer. If you focus on transfer and you focus on helping supervisors and management utilize that training, then you're most likely to lead to returns. That's a really good set of conclusions, but I'll wrap it up in 30 seconds by basically answering some key questions here. Is the offer of workplace training attractive to firms? Absolutely. We saw very high take-up rates, very low rates of withdrawal, very high degree of satisfaction, and the key to its attractiveness, again, is this issue of embedding the foundational skills training in a performance framework that makes sense to business. We saw a range of improvements in worker outcomes, both in skills, in performance, in retention and employment rates, as well as this whole host of social and well-being outcomes. We saw gains for employers across a whole range of business outcomes of interest to them, and ultimately a positive return on investment. But this critical point at the end is that there is significant variance. And if you want to convince an employer to do training, you don't just go in and show them, we've had a study that has done positive returns. You do an organizational needs assessment with them, and you show, look, you have the condition, you have the need, and you have the conditions that are ripe to generate a positive return, and then they're going to invest. Okay, Greg. Sean, we got any other questions? Hello?
Well, hi. Should have turned on my mic. We've had a comment about the actual nature of the study. There was a suggestion that possibly the groups could be divided into the control group, customized training group, and a standardized preset training option. Had you considered any other possibilities for extending this research if you were to get your wish for more research funding?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll comment on that specific example, but there are other issues we're exploring as well that we talk a little bit about in the report. In terms of various models like that, you're actually touching on one that we did explore with the funder very early on. There's different models of doing this. One that would look at, just a very strict foundational skills training versus one that had, there's different ways to embed, essential skills training within the workplace too that we could have tested variants. So you start with a base model, you do embedding a little bit differently, and we could see what those results are. Given where we were at when we started this study 3-4 years ago, and given where the field was at, this is the kind of study that I think we needed to demonstrate first, and validate the wonderful work that a lot of the practitioners are doing, and now we hope to dig in a little bit further. Just really briefly, some of the examples of studies that we're looking to take forward. I mean, the one obvious one is this kind of work and this kind of study is certainly generalizable to a broad range of service sectors beyond tourism, because the occupations and the needs are very similar in broader retail. However, the further you take this out, like into a manufacturing setting, it would be nice to do this kind of study in a manufacturing setting. So that's one thing, taking it to a different sector. The other is looking at different types of models of essential skills training, because there are constraints around this kind of a model. You can only take it so far in certain, like as we saw, we offered up to 40 hours. Most firms are only taking up to 20 hours of training because business constraints. It's hard to do workplace training. So, and it's even worse for some types of firms. Really small firms, you can't bring an outside trainer in if you have less than 20 people to do a group session. So there's various models of cluster, and which are referred to as hub models, where you try to achieve alignment, but the training takes place off-site. This is something we're exploring, as well as mentorship models. In some sectors, mentorship is a critical aspect of training, and it's the predominant way that training takes place. The quality of mentorship may suffer because of foundational skills gaps. So we're looking at models to enhance the quality of mentorship, as an example.
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. We don't have any further questions, so I think we'll end it there. I just want to mention that we will link to the final upskill report as well as the slide deck from today's presentation in the blog post with the video recording as well. So thanks again, David and Michael, for your presentation today, and of course thanks to all of you out there for attending. As I said, the session was recorded, and we will post the video of the presentation on our website and send you all the link in an email later this week. We have a couple of upcoming webinars. November 20th, we've got the Making Career Sense of LMI, and then the following week, an Orientation to Customized Employment Services on the 26th. So stay tuned to the website and to the newsletter for further information about these webinars and how to register. As always, we welcome your input and feedback, and we would also appreciate any suggestions you have for future webinar topics. When you leave the webinar today, you will be asked to complete a short survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you would take a minute or two to share your thoughts, as your feedback will help us immensely in planning future events. So that ends our webinar for today. On behalf of today's presenters and my colleagues here at the Center, thank you and have a great afternoon.